Можем ли мы отследить влияние движения Child Free на демографию, на решение наших граждан о том, рожать или нет детей?
On December the 4th, 2024, Russia's law prohibiting child-free ideology came into force. This lays bare one way the Russian government is supposedly trying to cope with long-term downward demographic trends. But these are not the Kremlin's only actions aimed at Russian women. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, life has become much harder for women. The state is becoming more aggressive in how it interferes with citizens' private lives, and women's rights provide a stark example of these changes. Our expert explains.
Russia is a state where the government is creating a top-down patriarchal culture of violence. It's partially based on the cult of toxic, dominating masculinity, with no respect for the weak. Such top-down violence means that first, the government uses violence against citizens, and then the strong will use violence against the weak. Curtailing women's rights also fits in with the totalitarian ambitions of the Russian state. It means that the state is interfering in the private lives of its citizens ever more often. For example, it represses Russians for making statements on specific issues, including in private conversations. It also encourages them to inform on each other. There are police raids on private parties, where they arrest people, for example, because there are LGBT+ people at the parties. And this was banned in Russia in 2023, being labeled as extremist. All this lays bare the idea that Russian citizens are the property of those in power, meaning that the government can arbitrarily decide on the life and death of its citizens. This has been stated a few times. For example, Vladimir Putin, during a meeting with the mothers of fallen soldiers, said that it was better for them to have died at the front than for them to drink themselves to death and never go to war.
The Russian government is dismantling the already weak constitutional system of citizens' rights. The ban on the so-called child-free ideology is a good example of this. It translates into a ban on publishing in the media or online any content which shows childlessness in a positive light. This is presented as being incompatible with the traditional moral and spiritual values in Russia.
Of course, it isn't clear where the limits of this public character lie, because Russian law is in general very flexible, and in practice, it's applied much more oppressively than it is on paper. But it's still a very convenient tool for repressing people. Fines for propagating content incompatible with the intentions of the government are quite high. The right to abortion and women's reproductive rights in general are also increasingly being restricted. The law itself is still very liberal. The Russian law states that a woman can request an abortion until the 12th week of pregnancy without having to explain why. Abortion is covered by the general medical insurance system, but there are also other conditions, which mean that while the law is very liberal, for years it has been undergoing a de facto dismantling by way of peri-statutory or simply legal actions, or legal actions of lower instance. For example, in 2015, the Ministry of Health signed an agreement with the Orthodox Church on coordinated actions to prevent abortions. Since then, increasingly often, women going to a clinic or to a hospital to legally terminate their pregnancy are sent for a consultation with an Orthodox priest. And since 2023, private clinics have been increasingly voluntarily removing abortions from their services. Of course, this is due to pressure from regional government. They understand what the general atmosphere is and what is wanted from the people at the top. Private clinics make up about a fifth of the total abortions in Russia. So this is a significant restriction on the availability of the procedure. And in state clinics, women are more subject to checks, and this opens up an unlimited range of informal, extra-legal methods of limiting the law. The government justifies this by saying Russian demography needs to be looked after. It's true that Russia is mired in a demographic crisis. The birth rate is at the lowest level for 10-20 years. But researchers agree that banning abortion or access to abortion will absolutely not solve the problem or improve the demographics. But it does create a huge risk for the health and lives of women, since at the moment, the only thing which is rising is backstreet abortions. The discussion on banning abortions or removing it from the list of medical services provided by general insurance has been going on for years. They've also been discussing banning abortions in private clinics. To date, this has not been passed at the federal level. This is all being done by way of informal incentives, prohibitions, creating an atmosphere, a kind of propaganda, indoctrination, and so on, and we can see a clear division of opinions in the government. There are supporters of radical restrictions on reproductive rights, obviously among conservatives, the Orthodox Church. Very many members of the Russian nomenklatura can see that these radical slogans can win them political capital, meaning that they can brown-nose the Kremlin. But there are still supporters of rational solutions. They block the most radical ideas to change the law. In my opinion, it's only a matter of time until the radical conservatives will lobby the Kremlin and the State Duma to pass some bills which will genuinely introduce bans. And then, most likely, Vladimir Putin will ratify it straight away, because we can see a certain evolution of his views, or at least of what he says publicly about it. In 2017, he was still saying that an abortion ban will certainly not improve the demographic problems. Back then, he listened to the rational arguments that it will only create a risk and will have very little benefit. But now he says that abortions are a huge concern in Russia and something needs to be done about it. This even though recent decades have seen a rapid fall in the number of abortions in Russia. At the end of the Soviet Union, there were around 4 million annually. And now it's 300,000 to 400,000 annually. According to various data, 120,000 of these are for medical reasons. And now we're also hearing the authorities say that the number of reasons for medical interventions should be radically reduced too.
The state of the Russian health service is declining from year to year. This is partly down to social services being redirected towards financing the war in Ukraine. Statistics also show the scale of the problem of Russian families. 38% of children are raised in single-parent families. In 80% of these cases, these are single mothers raising the children. 22% of children in Russia live in families below the poverty threshold. Russia's social system doesn't provide a level playing field, and having children is not linked to prosperity or an improved financial status.
Widać, że od początku pełnoskalowej inwazji Rosjanki.
Since the start of the full-scale invasion, we've seen that Russian women are less likely to want to have children, and this is seen in the birth rate and also in rising sales of contraceptives and the morning-after pill. There are two occasions when there was a clear increase. The first was after the start of the full-scale invasion, and the second was immediately after child-free ideology was banned. Russian women rushed to buy the morning-after pill, and this shows why Russian women don't want to have children. The broader context should also be taken into consideration, meaning that the war has caused an increase in very negative social phenomena, what we could call pathologies. By this I mean a tangible increase in drug abuse and an increase in alcohol consumption after years of being in decline. Domestic abuse, already at a high level in Russia, is increasing, and the government not only does nothing to counter it, in fact, it encourages violence using various methods and rhetoric. Veterans are returning from the front and are committing crimes. There are veterans suffering from PTSD. The Russian government is not working with these people. Instead, in recent months and weeks, they've published instructions for the partners of veterans on how to avoid provoking aggression from their partners. So this is nothing more than the propagation of this traditional patriarchal system based on the cult of toxic masculinity, where the victim is to blame for the violence, where the victim is responsible for the well-being of the perpetrator. It's more convenient for the state to take a step back and let the veterans vent their anger on their wife and children, rather than taking their aggression out into the public sphere, all the more so if they were to turn against the state.
And the Orthodox Church in Russia is also promoting militarism and traditional values.
W kilkunastu regionach Rosji kobietom, które chcą dokonać terminacji.
In over 10 Russian regions, women going for a legal abortion are handed a letter from Patriarch Kirill exhorting them to change their minds. Recently, there's been a glut of various instructive propaganda films showing the dangers of having an abortion and the benefits of having children. These films are sometimes shown in schools, and some of them are very gory and give a distorted view of how an abortion is carried out. These educational films are, let's say, full of lies, distortions, false or outdated data. They are meant to create an atmosphere of a total rejection of abortion as a woman's right, and the idea of not having children as being something immoral. And the most immoral thing in this is the fact that increasingly the rhetoric of the Russian government is portraying women as people producing cannon fodder. Literally, because these issues are very frequently linked. Women are meant to give birth to future soldiers. So on the one hand, the state wants to somehow improve the demographic situation by forcing women to give birth, by denying them the right to choose. But on the other hand, this same state is sending hundreds of thousands of men of reproductive age to the front, where these men will die or return with disabilities. This is a clear example of the real goals and motives of the Kremlin.
Doctors and society are overwhelmingly in favor of the freedom of choice and are against restricting women's reproductive rights. But the Russian government is less likely to concern itself with the public mood and is applying small but growing repressions in order to check how society will react to these changes in light of punishments for protests and opposition to the government. Russians are more likely to use individual survival strategies. They'll organize their own methods or use backstreet abortions before attempting to oppose the changes. This means that the practice will not stop. It will just move underground.
Są oczywiście też takie kuriozalne wypowiedzi ze strony.
There are, of course, some strange statements from some officials or members of parliament, which demonstrate there's a certain atmosphere in the circles of power in Russia. For example, one member of the State Duma declared that most likely practices such as voluntary abortion are one of the causes of the war in Ukraine. This, of course, sounds strange, but let's unpack this statement. The general narrative of the Russian government on this war is partly based on promoting the idea that it's a civilizational war. It's a war between good and evil, interpreted in absolute terms. And it's a war between traditional moral and spiritual values and Western Satanism, by which they mean liberal democracy. So these statements fit in with the general disturbing trend, which has steadily grown during Putinism, but which accelerated at the start of the full-scale invasion. And increasingly often, the state also uses different means, for example, financial means, to encourage women of the youngest generation, around 20 years old, to have children young. Students are among those being incentivized in one Russian region. They offer one-off payments if a student has a baby during her studies. But there's also the rhetoric from at least part of the government circles that women are giving in to their fancy by trying to achieve financial stability before thinking about children. First, they should have a child and only later start studying or work. According to available data quoted, for example, by some people in the government, 70% of all Russian marriages over 1 year end in divorce. So this also shows the situation pregnant women are in. There's a great likelihood that those women will end up alone with their child in the category of society's poorest. You can't count on the father in Russia. There are no patchwork families. Officially, the father shares full responsibility for raising a child, but more often women will be alone. A very common family in Russia is the mother, the child, and the grandmother. The role of the grandmother is very important, and I think deserving of separate treatment. But women are very often doomed to vegetation. The state does not hunt down fathers who don't pay alimony, and this creates a vicious circle. At the same time, the government's policy is simply to prohibit more things, and any already limited social benefits are falling because more money is being invested in military activity.
Russia's repressive law, above all, affects women, meaning 53% of the Russian population. Restricting women's rights is linked to other repression from the Russian government, for example, the criminalization of LGBT ideology. In practice, this means that it's no longer legal to talk about these people's rights in Russia. These restrictions overlap with other existing phenomena, indoctrination and the militarization of education, and also the terrible state of social services and social infrastructure which is available for normal Russians.
To wszystko
All of this combines into the larger problem of human rights and constitutional freedoms in Russia. The torture of prisoners, torture at police stations, law enforcement agencies using physical violence against citizens, and the so-called protection of order or the judiciary. And we could keep on adding these examples. But many years back, the Russian government started off by repressing fairly small groups, for example, restricting the freedom of religion. Then they began restricting the rights of further groups, claiming they were fighting extremism or the propaganda or defense of terrorism, for example. Now, this is how they silence the opponents of the regime. Then they banned talking about the rights and situation of LGBT plus people, and that's a big group. There's a new trend now which will most likely develop in a very negative, undesirable, concerning direction, which affects over half the Russian population. So we can see a clear trend towards restricting freedoms in both the public sphere and also the private sphere, in the most intimate of spheres concerning the basic life choices and the very existence of citizens of the Russian Federation.
Thanks for watching. On screen is another OSW video you might want to watch, and don't forget to subscribe.